Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Rachel said, I'm on the Xerces pesticide reduction team. I mostly work in residential landscapes in towns and cities, working to reduce pesticide use and to encourage pollinator-friendly landscaping and gardening practices. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all this morning about pesticide contamination in towns and cities and a bit about the Xerces study that we performed. I guess it was a couple of years ago in 2022, but we just got the paper published, which is really exciting. And before I begin, I do want to quickly thank our supporters because without them, we couldn't do the work that we do. And their support is really so important to us. And on that note, I do want to add that we are a donor-supported nonprofit. So if you aren't already a member and you're at all interested or able, I encourage you to donate and become a member today. You'll be joining a really extraordinary group of people who have shown themselves to be inquisitive and really engaged and who truly care about protecting invertebrates. And again, we really do rely on our members to do the work that we do. So if this is your first Xerces Society webinar, if you haven't heard of us before, we've been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. And our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. And it used to live in the coastal sand dune region around the San Francisco Bay Area. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work with programs focusing on pollinators, agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticide reduction. We also do a lot of community engagement work in residential communities. We really work in all sorts of areas, and this slide has some of those kind of representative areas in this photos. We have people working on mussels. We have the X Kids program that Rachel does. Yeah, really work in all sorts of areas. But I think maybe the most helpful work we do is writing these really detailed science-based guides for protecting pollinators, other invertebrates, pesticide reduction, all sorts of great information. And our website has these resources for free. There's national resources, there's regional resources on plants, pollinators, and all sorts of other topics. And it's really decades of work in this library, and it has fantastic resources. So I encourage you to go check it out at xerces.org. And there's materials related to what we're talking about today, pesticide reduction, as well as pollinator habitat plant selection, all sorts of great topics. Okay, so I want to give you a really quick outline of where we're going with this talk, just so that we're all on the same page. So to start, we'll talk a little bit about insect and butterfly declines and why they matter. Then we'll talk about this research project that we here at Xerces led, examining pesticide residue in urban butterfly host plants. And then after we discuss what we found, we'll talk a little bit about what that means and what we know about pesticide risks in our towns and our cities. And then we'll talk about some practical, both at home and kind of more community level solutions. So many of you may already be aware that there's many recent studies that are documenting declines in insect populations in communities worldwide. In particular, many pollinators, including bees and butterflies, are imperiled. And the data is fairly patchy because many insects aren't carefully monitored, unfortunately. But the data that we do have almost all points to decreases in populations around the world. And we know enough to know that it's essential to take action to conserve pollinators and other insects. And I want to hone in on butterflies and moths, the order Lepidoptera in particular, really quickly, because the study we're talking about today examined pesticide residue on butterfly host plants in particular. So we're losing butterflies, unfortunately. There was a recent study published this year with some Xerces scientists as co-authors, which is exciting, that found that over the last 20 years, the average butterfly abundance in the United States has declined by 22%. So this trend of butterfly declines fits in with that larger picture of insect declines more broadly. And you might ask, why does this matter? Why are we concerned with conserving insects? And the reason is that insects do so much, both for us and for ecosystems. They recycle nutrients through the ecosystem, they're soil engineers, they're decomposers. They also offer free pest control services. Predators and parasitoids, you think of lady beetles and little parasitoid wasps like the one on the middle left photo here, do so much work keeping pest insects in check, both in agriculture and in our own home gardens, as well as in natural areas, of course, as well. Insects are also food sources for other animals and are incredibly important in that role. So, speaking of caterpillars, of butterflies and moths, chickadees need to eat about 10,000 caterpillars to fledge a nest. That takes place in about 3 weeks. So, the rough math is about 450 caterpillars a day, which is really astounding. About 9 in 10 bird species eat insects at some point in their life, and insects are really a tremendous source of protein for these organisms that eat them. Pound for pound, insects actually have more than twice as much protein as beef does. And finally, insects are pollinators. They help plants reproduce, and the seeds and fruit that are produced from pollination are food for other creatures, including us, of course. So there's several causes of insect declines that scientists agree on, with the largest being habitat loss, as well as climate change. But another leading cause are pesticides. And this is the threat that's present in residential landscapes, not just in agricultural areas. It doesn't matter how much climate resilient habitat we protect and we restore, if we're not protecting that habitat from pesticides. So, despite the doom and gloom about insect declines we just discussed, I do want to stress that our residential landscapes, where we live, where we work, where we recreate, really can support beneficial insects like pollinators. In fact, these landscapes can actually harbor surprisingly abundant and diverse pollinator communities. And the reason for this is largely because we provide resources all spring into the fall in the form of flowering plants in our yards and our parks. This is providing the resources that these pollinators and other beneficial insects need to thrive. These areas can also often have lower pesticide exposure than surrounding agricultural areas and serve as a refuge for pollinators and other insects. So because of all of this, residential areas really do have a high conservation potential for invertebrates, which I find really exciting, doing a lot of work in these areas. But this potential is even greater if we're designing and we're managing these spaces, thinking about the needs of insects like pollinators. And one of these really key factors is making sure that these spaces are free from pesticides. So before we dive in and talk about the study, I want to quickly review some of the risks pesticides do pose to pollinators and other invertebrates. And this might be review for some of you who have seen some of our Xerces pesticide talks before, but I think it's important information just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page. So why are pesticides such an issue for pollinators and other insects? And I want to start by noting that pesticide is an umbrella term, and our focus is mostly on insecticides, which kill insects, as well as on herbicides, which kill plants, and fungicides, which kill fungi. Most of you are likely aware that many insecticides are very toxic to pollinators and other insects as they're designed to kill them. Some insecticides are more targeted than others in the groups of insects that they impact, but many tend to be very broad. They'll kill the target pest, but also everything else in your yard or in a park or in an agricultural area, wherever they're applied. And modern insecticides are very potent, and newer ones, you may have heard of neonicotinoids or neonics, that have been made to replace some of the older chemicals, aren't actually more friendly to pollinators and are more concerning in many ways. Uh, I like to say this, and again, you may have heard me say this before, and I want to note quickly that one of the other downsides of pesticides is that they're only treating the symptom of the pest outbreak, but not the cause of the outbreak itself. So we like to say it's kind of like taking Advil for a headache when really you need to get new glasses, for example, or stop staring at computer screens. So this might be a little bit in the weeds, but I did want to touch briefly on pesticide oversight and why just following the label on a bottle of pesticides isn't enough to protect pollinators and other beneficial insects. Really well-intentioned gardeners might think that if you just follow this label, it's going to protect pollinators sufficiently. But many people don't realize that there are reasons that this isn't the case. We want to, in fact, do much more than just follow the label on a bottle of pesticides. The reason for this is that current federal regulation states that pesticides should have, quote, no unreasonable adverse effects. But that's really open to interpretation. Federal pesticide regulation both accepts and expects there to be risks to wildlife. They just believe that the benefits that are provided by the pesticides outweigh the harm that they cause. So when we're trying to recover pollinator species or really create these oases or havens for insects in our urban spaces, that standard isn't enough, which is why we really try to encourage people to go beyond just following what's on the label on a bottle of pesticides and find ways to truly protect these species in the long term. So we're obviously concerned about insecticide use because of the, dramatic impacts they have on pollinators and other beneficial insects, again, because they're designed to kill insects. But I also want to note really quickly that there are also concerns with fungicides and herbicides as well. Both fungicides and herbicides have been shown to have some negative impacts on pollinators, so I just wanted to note that really quickly. Fungicides are often classified as practically non-toxic, but some have been linked with subtle yet harmful impacts. There was one study that found symptoms resembling malnutrition were noted in bees after exposure to some fungicides. And there's other types of fungicides that actually interact synergistically with certain insecticides, which means they actually increase the toxicity to bees when they're present together. And we'll touch on that a little bit more in some later slides. The main impact of herbicides is simply that they remove flowers from the landscape. And these flowers are what provide the pollen and nectar that bees and butterflies and other insects rely on for food. But there are also some studies that suggest that some herbicides like glyphosate might impact bees' abilities to navigate and also interfere with bees' gut microbes and potentially make them more susceptible to disease. So when we think about these chemicals in our residential landscapes, insects can be exposed in many different ways. Focusing on butterflies and other caterpillars, as an example, again, since that's what we're talking about in our sampling study, pesticides can be pervasive throughout a butterfly's life cycle. If a plant has pesticides applied to it, if a butterfly is using that plant, it can be exposed at every stage throughout its life, whether it's an egg, whether it's the larva itself, or whether it's an adult visiting a flower. If pesticides are applied to this plant, or maybe the plant is in a pesticide-free area, but pesticides drift from another place for moving it in wind, in rain, or soil, this contamination could be enough to kill this butterfly at any point in its life cycle, or just to cause its health to decline to the point where it's less healthy and then less successful. And this image just kind of shows some of those different stages and how pesticides might be impacting them. So the pesticide team here at Xerces, we've done a number of different pesticide sampling studies over the past few years, some of which you may be familiar with. So we sampled pesticide residues in milkweed plants up and down the Central Valley of California. We sampled milkweed at retail nurseries in 15 different states to see what the contamination levels were. And in another study that will be published soon, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we looked at residues in yards that have been sprayed for mosquitoes. And then finally, we conducted the study that we're talking about today. We sampled butterfly host plants in Sacramento, California, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, to look at pesticide residues in those plants. So, as most of you who are familiar with the work that we do here at Xerces, we do a lot of outreach helping people create pollinator habitat in their yards and then also in other urban areas like parks. But as we encourage people to build this habitat in residential spaces, we want to make sure that we understand the risks from pesticides when we're recommending people to create habitat in towns and cities. And the question of whether urban habitat is safe from pesticides is something that's still pretty unclear. There hasn't been a lot of research done looking at contamination in these urban spaces. So we conducted this study to try to get a better sense of how healthy these spaces are and how management in urban spaces could be improved to better protect butterflies from pesticides. So as a quick overview, in this study, we sampled 336 individual butterfly host plants across both cities. And these were plants that caterpillars use to develop, that they feed on as caterpillars. And we sampled both in urban parks managed by the cities, as well as privately managed gardens and pollinator gardens in the two cities. 181 of these plants were in Sacramento, and 155 were in Albuquerque. And then we sent these leaves shipped overnight on ice packs to the lab that we used, and they screened them for 94 different pesticides. This included insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, as well as breakdown products of those pesticides. And I want to note really quickly that the analysis that the lab did wasn't able to look at some very common pesticides, unfortunately, like glyphosate, the common herbicide, or pyrethroids, a common insecticide class. They weren't captured with this lab method. So this is a little bit of an underestimate of what maybe the true contamination is in these areas. So to select plants, we wanted to find plants that were Lepidoptera or butterfly and moth host plants. We also wanted plants that were present within the city limits, and we wanted to make sure that they were growing at times that caterpillars would be actually actively feeding on them. I want to note as a quick aside, it was actually surprisingly hard to find population of plants to sample. There was a lack of good butterfly and moth host plants, especially in Sacramento where I did the study. I could find green-looking space pretty easily, but then, when you look closely, it was mostly turf and ornamental plants like arborvitae, maybe hydrangeas. So we had to be pretty opportunistic and cast a wide net to look for any plants that are host plants to butterflies and moths within these cities. We mostly looked at native plants, but we did sample a few non-native plantain, the genus Plantago, in turf because it's heavily used by common buckeyes as a host plant. And here's a photo of a plantain with feeding damage on it from one of our sites. So site and plant selection were of course tightly linked, and for both we used iNaturalist observations to get a sense of what plants were growing at different sites throughout the cities, and then we visited the sites and kind of did on-the-ground scouting to make sure that the plants were actually there. So this was for parks, and then to recruit volunteers with gardens that were willing to let us sample, we did some online surveys. And I should note for all the private sites, the owners claimed that they didn't use pesticides. So in Sacramento, these were the plants we sampled. Some were herbaceous, others were woody. You can see we had oaks, willows, as well as some flowering herbaceous plants like yarrow, lupins. You can kind of see that list right there. Penstemons. And these were the Albuquerque plants we sampled. Again, a mix of herbaceous and woody plants. So sampling in the field, we sampled 10 individuals of each plant species per site. Some sites only had one target species, others had like two or three different target species we were looking at. But for each of these plants, we cut 5 to 10 grams of leaves with clippers, and then folded them up in foil and put them in coolers and ice packs. We tried to sample plants distributed throughout the range of each site to kind of cover the range of site conditions. Here's some photos to kind of show what some of those sites look like. This one was actually in a Xerces habitat kit planting. This one was kind of in a park drainage area. You can see some willows that we were sampling near the American River, another pollinator garden at a community center. So again, we screened these samples for 94 different compounds, and we also did a literature search to find relevant toxicology data for each of these compounds and butterflies, looking for things like the lethal dose or other negative impacts. One of the ones we found was reduced wing size. So this was so we could try to tie what we detected in the field to real-world impacts on butterflies and moths. But unfortunately, very little of this data actually exists, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so what did we find? Let's dive in. So unfortunately, we found that contamination was nearly ubiquitous, very widespread. I'll break this out by city in a moment, but overall, this is what we found. Across 336 butterfly host plants, 93% of them were contaminated with at least one pesticide. We found 47 different compounds, and this included 14 insecticides, 10 herbicides, 20 fungicides, one antibiotic, and then a breakdown product of an insecticide, and one adjuvant, which is a chemical added to increase the effectiveness of a pesticide. We had an average of about 3 pesticides per plant, with a maximum of 18 pesticides on a contaminated plant. So most plants had multiple pesticides present. So let's look at this by city. So here's a map which shows where we sampled in Sacramento. Labeled points are public parks, and unlabeled points are the private gardens. These colors show which plant genera we sampled at that site, for those who are botanically inclined and interested. And you can find this figure in the actual paper, and I'll share. You can email me, and I can send you the link for the paper, so you can look at this in more detail if you're interested. But here's what we found in Sacramento. Out of 181 plants, 94% had at least one pesticide, and again, up to 18 detected on a single plant. We found 37 separate compounds in Sacramento with an average of 5.5 pesticides per plant. In Albuquerque, there was a similar story. Again, here's the map of our sampling. Though in Albuquerque, the maximum pesticides per contaminated plant was lower, with that maximum being 11, and we had a slightly lower average with about 2.5 compounds per plant. And overall, we detected 31 different compounds in Albuquerque. And again, this was across 151 plants. Okay, so what pesticides did we find? As I mentioned, we found 47, but some of these were, only in a few plants, or not as ubiquitous. But several of these pesticides were found very widely across these sites. So these were the most commonly found pesticides. In Sacramento, the pesticides that we found in more than 50% of the samples were azoxystrobin, a fungicide found in 84% of the plants, methoxyfenicide, an insecticide, we found in 78% of the samples, and then fluopyrim, a fungicide, found in 63% of the plants. In Albuquerque, the prevalent compounds that we found in more than 20% of plants were atrazine, an herbicide, which was found very widely in 70% of the plants, promethrin, an herbicide, found in 28% of the plants. Azoxystrobin, again, was found in Albuquerque in 26% of the plants, and then diuron, an herbicide, was found in 20% of the Albuquerque samples. Okay, so what does this all mean for butterflies? As I mentioned, we looked at toxicity data to try to get a sense of what our findings mean in a real-world sense. But unfortunately, the risks to butterflies are unknown for the majority of the compounds we detected. This is because the risks to butterflies aren't required to be tested when a pesticide is registered by the EPA. This is unfortunately a major knowledge gap, but I will focus on the pesticides that we do have that information on. So I'm going to quickly talk about azoxystrobin, a fungicide, and then chlorantraniliprole, an insecticide. So 28% of sampled plants in Sacramento contained azoxystrobin concentrations that are known to reduce monarch butterfly wing size. So most of these plants were actually in public parks, and this might not seem like a big deal, but for a species that flies, especially monarchs, which can fly great distances, you can imagine how a reduced wing size might impact their ability to disperse, potentially migrate, gather resources, reproduce, things like that. This is important to remember, I think, and something insidious about background contamination. Even when it's at what seems like a pretty low level, it still can potentially weaken insects or make them sick, and impact their populations in that way. So next is chlorantraniliprole. Although it wasn't the most prevalent compound, it hit a toxicity threshold everywhere that we did find it. So 14% of sampled plants had residues of chlorantraniliprole at levels that exceeded those known to kill 10% of a monarch caterpillar population. And 5 of these plants contained chlorantraniliprole residues that exceeded levels known to kill 50% of a monarch caterpillar population, or what's called the LC50. Chlorantraniliprole is a diamide insecticide that's often being used to replace neonicotinoids. A common product is acelepryn. Uh, Chlorantraniliprole is moderately systemic, which means it can be absorbed by plants, making the entire plant toxic. And while chlorantraniliprole is much less toxic to honeybees than some of these other insecticides, it's actually several orders of magnitude more toxic to butterflies like monarchs. And it's also very long-lived with a half-life of around, it's actually over 600 days. And that's the time it takes for half of it to break down. And it's often found in lawn treatments to kill grubs that's applied to lawns. So definitely a risky pesticide for butterflies in the urban environment. And I also do want to just mention atrazine really quickly. Although this isn't one of the compounds that we have that specific toxicity data for, unfortunately, a recent EPA report found that atrazine harms diverse species protected by the Endangered Species Act, including a third of land invertebrates that are listed. This includes butterflies and other pollinators. So just wanted to note this was found very widely in Albuquerque. Definitely is still a pesticide of concern. So one thing we were able to look at in California that we weren't able to do in Albuquerque is examine whether the compounds could have come from agricultural sources. And this is because California has arguably the most robust pesticide use reporting system in the country, and growers and then also licensed applicators in urban areas have to report pesticide usage at the county level. So we were able to get that data and look at that usage data for Sacramento County and a nearby county to see if the pesticides we found could have come from outside agricultural sources. And what we found was that it was very likely that the contamination we observed from several compounds came from these agricultural sources. The first was methoxyfenicide, which I've mentioned a few times now. That was the one that was found in a whopping 78% of plants in Sacramento. And the only reported uses in the months preceding our testing were in agriculture. So we can presume that the detections we found in these urban areas may likely have come from these off-site agricultural sources. Thiobencarb was found in 30% of our Sacramento samples, and it's only used on rice in California, meaning its findings were likely due to movement from surrounding agricultural use. So again, before I move on to the next slide, this kind of just drives home the point that pesticides don't stay where they're applied. They move in our environment. So let's drill in a little bit more on pesticides in residential landscapes and what we know about the risks and factors at play. Even if we don't have all the data, and there's a lot more that we'd like to know, lots of studies that would be great to do, we know that there are real pesticide risks in residential landscapes to invertebrate species that we're trying to conserve. And this study and our other sampling studies have just added to this, growing body of evidence. So again, as this recent study shows, there really is pervasive background contamination found in our towns and cities. We found up to 18 pesticides on a single plant in our study. In our other Xerces study in the Central Valley that included residential areas, we found an average of 9 pesticides per milkweed plant that we surveyed. So we know that, pollinator plants are often contaminated. But beyond pollinator plants themselves, U.S. Geological Survey testing has found high amounts of pesticides in streams and water bodies throughout urban areas. One of their reports found that 90% of the sampled urban streams and rivers contained levels of pesticides risky for aquatic life, which is actually a lot higher than the 61% of rivers and agricultural areas that they found. Sampling of urban streams in King County, Washington, for example, found 37 different pesticides present in these waterways. So we know plants are contaminated, water is often contaminated. Even high levels of pesticides have been found contaminating roads and sidewalks. There was a study in Riverside, California that found over 99% of hard surfaces they sampled in residential neighborhoods had pesticide residues detected with an average of 6 pesticides per sample. And these were surfaces like sidewalks and curbside gutters at the bottom of driveways. So we know there's this background contamination that can potentially impact insects. So one of this, which we touched on a few slides ago, is that pesticides are almost always found in these mixtures in the environment. So this can have additive effects where the toxicity essentially stacks together, or sometimes what's called synergistic effects, where combinations of pesticides actually increase their toxicity when they're present together. One example is certain insecticides and what are called the azole fungicides. When they're present together, the insecticides are more toxic to the insects because the fungicides actually interfere with the insect's ability to detoxify that insecticide. And how these various cocktails of pesticides are interacting with our native pollinator species is largely unknown, unfortunately. We touched on this briefly, but low levels of pesticide contamination can still cause harm, even if they're detected at less than a dose that would kill an individual insect. So these impacts are anything short of death, like decreased growth, a behavioral change, a change in physiology, a change in the insect's learning ability, things like that. In our study, the one impact we were able to tie to the compounds we found was that reduced wing size. So many of these impacts might reduce an insect's ability to reproduce or gather food for its offspring, and these small effects can add up at the population level. This image here shows a Ceratina bee, a small carpenter bee, nesting in a blueberry cane stem. If this blueberry plant was treated with a systemic pesticide, meaning again it's uptaken by the plant, making the whole plant toxic, this bee and her offspring could be, constantly exposed to this pesticide through the nesting materials itself, not even the food that they're eating. So this is just an example of how this background contamination can be found in many different locations. Pesticides also move across the landscape. This is a reminder that pesticide use doesn't just impact where we use pesticides, but they readily move off-site. This was apparent in our study results, where we found these pesticides that were only used in agriculture, miles away from where we sampled. In our residential landscapes, we can experience all sorts of movement, drift through the air when something like a mosquito spray takes place and the wind blows it into a neighboring property, or runoff from rain or when watering a lawn, for example. Our lawns in urban areas tend to be very hard and compacted, and they can function as impervious surfaces. So that means, a hard surface like a road or a sidewalk. But turf then is often treated with herbicides to kill weeds or insecticides to kill things like grubs, and these can be easily washed off-site. Some other pesticides move readily through the soil, and then others that bind tightly to the soil can be blown around in dust and dirt particles. So this is just a reminder that addressing pesticide contamination often needs to happen both locally, but then also more broadly. So because of how easily pesticides can move across the landscape, tying into that last slide, this means that they can come from unexpected sources, which can lead to unexpected contamination. And one of the things we like to mention that's really tricky about pesticide use is that it's invisible, which can make it really hard to see or address. So now that we touched on these risks, there's a number of different ways that our study is probably underestimating risk. We know that pesticides move around and drift. These results don't necessarily indicate where the pesticides were applied, only where they ended up, and the risk may have been higher in certain areas due to this. Many chemical mixtures are known to increase risk, as we discussed, but we don't know to what extent that's happening in our study, even though we found an average of 5.5 compounds per plant in Sacramento, for example. We only, or I should say, we only have a subset of the potential chemicals out there because our lab methods couldn't capture some of these other very risky um, insecticides and some other herbicides. So that's just something to keep in mind. And we also, again, only have information on harm to butterflies for a small number of pesticides that were detected. Again, this information isn't required by the EPA when registering pesticides. Instead, it's usually done by independent academic researchers after products are already registered and brought to market. And most of these studies that we do have are done on limited species like the monarch butterfly. And we have so many native butterfly species, and we don't have data on how the pesticides are impacting them. So despite these risks from pesticides in our urban environment, I really do want to encourage you, hopefully, that we can all be part of this solution to addressing this kind of ubiquitous contamination in urban areas. And I want to run through a few examples of hidden risks around the home that people often don't realize introduce pesticides to the environment. A tricky thing, again, with pesticide use and contamination is that it's invisible, which can lead to these unseen or hidden risks. So we'll talk about some of these and then some changes people can try to make at the community level. I'm not going to go into how to manage your yard without pesticides because that would be a totally different hour-long talk. But we have a lot of resources on the topic that you can find in our resource library and also Xerces webinars on YouTube as well. So as we talk about solutions to pesticide use, including halting the use of pesticides in our residential landscapes, I think it's really important to note that 98% of insects are not what we would consider pests. And this might catch you by surprise given how much attention pest species get, but only an estimated about 2% of all insects cause economic damages or health damages to people. The rest are vital as food for other species. They provide pest control, recycle nutrients, and of course, provide pollination. As Rachel Carson said, yet most of the chemicals now used kill all insects, our friends and enemies alike. So I think I've said this like 3 times now, but the trouble with pesticide use is that it's invisible. So these hidden risks from the use of these chemicals can then kind of go undetected and end up in our plants and impact species in urban areas. So beyond the typical pesticide use we might think of, like spraying to control a pest on your plants, there are some ways that pesticides can get into our residential landscapes that we might not think of. One of these is honestly not so hidden, but it's treatments by pest control companies. These companies often use all sorts of tactics to try to get people to sign up and participate, and are often somewhat misleading in their marketing and communication, so that they conceal the true risk to insects. They'll send salespeople door to door to try to get people to sign up for preventative sprays, meaning they'll apply pesticides on a regular schedule, but not do any type of monitoring of pest insects to actually justify the applications. And I've heard of discounts being given if multiple people on a block all sign up, for example. The language that some of these companies use can also be misleading. And often repeated phrase is that the applications are safe without disclosing what they're spraying, without mentioning that other insects that come into contact will die as well. So a really well-intentioned resident or homeowner might think that these applications only kill pests and hiring these companies isn't causing any type of ecological harm, when in fact they are toxic to the broader insect community in their yards. Sometimes they'll say, and this actually was used on me when I was renting and somebody was coming and spraying things in the yard, and I asked, they'll say that they're natural or just derived from flowers, when in fact they are using synthetic and toxic insecticides. And even if they are just spraying pyrethrum, which is derived from chrysanthemum flowers, just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safe. This is still a pretty toxic insecticide, even if it does break down relatively quickly. So this is a hidden risk to be aware of. Just because a company claims something is safe doesn't necessarily mean that it is. Another kind of related risk is treatments from pest control companies that are designed to kill nuisance pests like spiders and ants, or treatments to deal with structural pests. And a real world example of this is in one of our earlier Xerces studies where we sampled milkweed from a number of different sites to look at pesticides. There was one home where pesticides hadn't been applied in at least 6 years. And we found that the milkweed was contaminated with a really concerning level of an insecticide that's commonly used to manage structural pests. Called fipronil. And we found out that right before the current owner moved in 6 years ago, the home had been treated for ants or termites. And then after moving in, the new homeowner planted milkweed in that treated area for monarch habitat, and that soil's been a source of insecticide exposure ever since. So pollinator attractive plants around the exterior of houses may be a source of exposure if these homes have been treated for structural pests. So this is just something to think of, an example of how pesticide exposure can come from places you might not immediately think of. Tree treatments are another source. You might have a tree that looks unhealthy or is struggling in some way, so you'll call an arborist or a tree doctor, and that person might inject or otherwise treat the tree with a systemic fungicide or insecticide. Again, systemic means the pesticide is uptaken into the plant or tree itself, and this makes the woody part, the leaves, but also the pollen and nectar all toxic. And tree injections or soil drenches that are designed to be uptaken by trees can be a really long-term source of toxic exposure because the insecticides like neonics, which are frequently used, can last for a really long time in woody plants. There's been studies that have found toxic levels persisting for months to years later. And the reason for this is that the inside of trees are a very stable environment. There's no sunlight, there's no rain, there's no oxygen, all of which normally cause pesticides to degrade. And then this can, of course, lead to much longer exposure potential to the caterpillars and other insects that are relying on these trees to survive. Finally, another hidden risk for pesticide exposure in the home garden is plants purchased from nurseries. The demand for nursery plants to be aesthetically appealing, we like pretty plants on the shelf, for them to be pest-free and damage-free, is really high. That, combined with interstate rules to reduce pest spread, really has led to significant pesticide use in nursery production. And a number of different studies have found neonicotinoids and other pesticides contaminating plants, including that study that we performed with partners, where we sampled milkweed at retail nurseries in 15 different states around the country. And in this study, milkweed samples had an average of 12 pesticides present, including plants that were labeled bee friendly and we don't spray neonics. So this is obviously very concerning, and you might ask, what can you do? So we like to suggest that people can ask for organic plants and avoid plants treated with these long-lived, highly toxic systemic insecticides, and to also try to get to know nursery practices to make sure they're using pollinator-friendly production. The local nursery might not know because they might be purchasing their plants from a grower, but we hope that this will begin to demonstrate consumer demand for bee-safe plants. And we have a fact sheet available on our website that goes into how to ask for bee safe plants from your nursery. And if you don't know whether the plant you bought was grown in a pollinator-friendly manner, you can assume it might be contaminated. And there's a few actions you can take to limit harm, including assuming the soil your plant comes in is contaminated. So dump as much of that soil as you can so the plant doesn't continue to take up more pesticides from the soil. You can also net your plant to prevent pollinators from coming the first year. Plants can have high concentrations of pesticides in the leaves, pollen, and nectar, but that will break down over time. So just using a fine mesh that first year can prevent insects from utilizing it as a resource and protecting them from those pesticides. Okay, so scaling up beyond the yard, there are things you can do at the community level. One is simply outreach, and you can use your own yard or community garden as an outreach tool. You can garden by example. There's lots of studies that kind of show gardening in neighborhoods is kind of contagious. One person kind of changes the social norms by gardening in a certain way, and then other people subconsciously think that, hey, that's acceptable. I can start using these cool plants, these different plants that might not necessarily have the conventional aesthetics. You can also put signage up. We have a pesticide-free sign in our Xerces gift shop, for example, that kind of are almost interpretive signage that kind of show what you're doing with your yard and why you're doing it that way. There's also in-person and online garden tours that I've heard being really successful, where people walk people through, what plants they're using, why they're using those plants, how they do what they're doing. I think that can be a really effective way to do some kind of local outreach. You can also do talks and tabling. Neighborhood events can be really effective. I've heard of people, in their neighborhood farmers market putting up a booth and talking about native plant gardening and pesticide reduction. You can also tandem with existing events like local Earth Day events or parades, for example. I also know of people who've pitched local news or newsletters to write little op-eds about, pollinator gardening and pesticide reduction. And you can also try to work with your community to have pesticide-free parks as well, which is something that I know some people have had some success with, especially through our Bee City program. To that last point, I think something that's really exciting is that many cities and campuses around the country are already making great strides at reducing pesticide use and implementing some sustainable pest management practices. We really believe that every single community and campus can reduce their pesticide use. And we have a great new resource that my colleague Jacqueline put together to help guide conversations at the community level. You might have concerns about pesticide use in your city or campus. You might want to start talking with your community land managers about reducing pesticide risk for pollinators. And to get the conversation going, we put together 10 questions to ask your parks department or similar entity about pesticide use. And you can find it at our Bee City USA website in the Integrated Pest Management Toolkit. You can also reach out to us directly if you want tips on engaging with your local parks department or local city council or writing a letter, trying to make this difference at a local level. On the topic of bee cities, you could also work to make your city or campus or town a Xerces Bee City. In Xerces Bee City and Campus USA program, affiliate communities or college campuses make several commitments to protect pollinators, and one of these is pesticide reduction. Cities and parks departments need to develop an integrated pest management plan for city properties, and many do a lot of work encouraging residential reduction as well. I wanted to highlight a really quick, great example of a broader community-wide campaign in Decatur, Georgia. They've created a really great education program by expanding the information section they have about residential mosquito spraying on their Bee City website. They've developed literature to hand out, created large mosquito spraying kills bees branded signs to put in yards, like the ones pictured here. And as part of their public education campaign, they make use of social media, table at events like farmers markets or at nurseries. They also do presentations to neighborhood associations and community groups, and also work directly with the city's Environmental Sustainability Board to enact formal policies to emphasize alternatives to chemical controls. So I think this is a really inspiring example of community members doing outreach and policy to reduce pesticide use in their community. We didn't talk much about mosquito sprays in this talk, but I do want to quickly note that it can be a major source of pesticides in urban areas in many regions around our country. And at the local level, vector control districts or municipalities are in charge of managing mosquito populations on public lands and coordinating community-wide responses. And many of them do really wonderful work. But in other cases, the management plans might be lacking in a little bit. And I want to note that, we are very cognizant of disease risks and are not trying to minimize them, but there are ways to manage mosquitoes without relying primarily on spraying for adult mosquitoes. And we have a lot of resources and webinars available on this. Feel free to send us an email if you'd like links to those resources. This is another topic that it can be its own webinar. But as a quick general summary, a really good mosquito control district program involves investing in public education and communication to make sure everyone knows what they can do to stay safe, healthy, and reduce mosquito populations at home through common sense methods. It should also involve active monitoring of mosquitoes and thresholds for tolerance, in particular for disease and populations of the mosquitoes species that are actually the ones responsible for vectoring diseases. High populations of other mosquito species might be a nuisance, warranting non-chemical reduction efforts, but they're not what should trigger chemical treatments. Um, so with this in mind, if you want to get involved at the community level, the first step is to learn what is happening in your area and find out if your county has a mosquito management plan. If so, does it include monitoring? Is there an outreach program to promote efforts at home to reduce mosquito concerns? Do they spray for mosquitoes? And if so, do they have thresholds, like only when disease incidence reaches a certain level? And we have this resource that can help you with this called How to Help Your Community Create an Effective Mosquito Management Plan, which kind of walks through some of these steps. So feel free to check this out if this is a subject you're interested in. So I kind of want to end here by re-emphasizing that our urban areas, including our yards and urban parks, really can function as high-quality habitat and refuge for insects and other animals like birds, even at the single site level, like a yard or a park. But together, if we have a number of these sites in a nearby area, they can scale up and provide even more high-quality, connected, functional habitat across the landscape, and really increase the conservation potential of these areas. But to achieve this potential, we do need to protect these spaces from pesticides. I just want to give one last plug that we do have a variety of resources related to this topic that can help. Here are a few that are particularly relevant. And again, we have other resources for community pesticide reduction. So please feel free to go to the Xerces site and check this out. And I do want to say thank you so much on this host plant paper that we just published. I want to thank our collaborators, Dr. Matt Forrester, Clara Ditmore, who was the first author on this paper, Dr. Angie Leonard, Dr. Maggie Douglas, and also Dr. Krish Halsh for all of their work in helping us come up with this project and implement it, analyze the data, and write the paper. And this paper is published in Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. And anybody who's interested, please send me an email, and I'm happy to send you a copy of the paper. And with that, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. And here's my personal Xerces email on this slide, and then also our general pesticides@xerces.org email. And if anybody has questions, thoughts, concerns, please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to follow up with you.
Thank you, Aaron. Great presentation. We have a couple questions in the Q&A. So the first one, Mary's wondering why wasn't glyphosate tested? Most residents use Roundup, and that typically has glyphosate in it.
Yeah, it would have been great to have glyphosate tested, but unfortunately, the kind of standard panel of testing, I'm not a chemist, so I don't have all of the nitty-gritty details, but my understanding is glyphosate needs a totally different sampling, or I should say analysis method than a lot of these other pesticides do. So it's often not included in the standard kind of panels of testing panels because yeah, it needs its own really hyper-specific method to analyze it. So unfortunately, it's often not included, and we weren't able to have it tested for. But that would be something that would be really great to know, since it is one of the most commonly used, if not the most commonly used, pesticide in urban areas.
Definitely, thank you. All right, next question. Curtis is wondering in Bucks County, PA, and Pennsylvania, the Board of Health sprays duet at night as to not affect bees and butterflies. They've recently emailed them to stop, but they're only one person. And it seems that the nonprofits are prohibited from getting involved in government. What can Curtis do, and how can they help?
That's a really great question. I think that, to kind of answer that question, we would need to know a little bit more of the nuances of the specific, kind of Bucks County Board of Health and things like that. My colleague Jacqueline Buenrostro does a lot of work working with kind of local municipalities and residential mosquito sprays and trying to help people. And she has been doing a lot of work in Pennsylvania. So Curtis, if you want to send me an email or send the pesticides@xerces.org email, I can link you up with Jacqueline. And I think she'll have some ideas and resources because she's been working with a few different people actually in Pennsylvania on some of these mosquito spray issues.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to go to this next question because it's the only one left. Feel free to use the Q&A if you have any questions. It is about mosquito dunks. I hope it's okay to
Yeah,
ask a tangential question because you are the mosquito
please do.
person at Xerces. Are mosquito dunks better than spraying in regards to helping invertebrates?
That's a great question, one that has been coming up more and more. So mosquito dunks, for people who aren't aware, are these kind of donut-shaped things that are use BT, which is a kind of biopesticide that is toxic to the specific strain that they use in these mosquito dunks are toxic to mosquitoes and closely related flies. And people will put these in buckets. And I'm guessing this is what you were mentioning, Mary. They'll create these mosquito, they call it the bucket of doom, I think, where you put the mosquito dunk in with some organic matter and water, and you essentially are drawing the mosquitoes in, and then they'll lay their eggs into this water that has the dunk in it, and that dunk is toxic to the developing mosquito larvae, and they'll die. So mosquito dunks are much better than spraying in regards to helping invertebrates because these dunks are much more targeted, and they're also not spraying the broader environment where they might get all sorts of insects that are susceptible to these pesticides. Um, will caution that we do not recommend you use mosquito dunks in natural bodies of water. That's, not a place where you would want to be putting them because they are toxic to these other types of flies as well, like shore flies and different types of gnats. Um, for the dunks, I don't think it hurts to try them. I haven't found a lot of hard evidence that actually suggests that these kind of bucket traps actually reduce mosquito populations in an individual yard. There have been some studies on similar things, and it seems like they might be the most effective as a community-wide effort where you have like three on a property throughout an entire neighborhood. That seems like it can demonstrably reduce mosquito populations. If you just have one or two in your yard, it might not be enough, but at the same time, if it's something that you want to try and it seems like it's making a difference in your yard, I wouldn't discourage you. But I think it's one of those things that if you talk to your neighbors and you get more people involved, maybe you'll have more success. Hopefully that answers the questions. I kind of rambled there a little bit, but
No, it was all good. Another question came in from Diane, one of our ambassadors, our volunteers. Hi, Diane. That's a great question. Do you need to worry about pesticides in compost from citywide leaves and plant collections?
that's a great question, Diane. And that's actually something that I don't have any hard data on. I'm happy to do a little bit of research on that and try to get back to you. I'm not sure if there's been any studies that have actually looked at pesticides in some of these citywide leaf and plant collections, but I do know the potential risk is there. I think especially for a municipality that maybe is treating a lot of trees for something like emerald ash borer, for example. A lot of these pesticides really can last for several years in some of these trees. And because they're systemic, this means that they're, you know, expressed throughout the whole plant, including the leaves, which means that the fallen leaves, and that we do have data on. We know that fallen leaves from treated trees do have pesticides in them. Whether that means that then after being composted, um, that's a risk to your yard, is a question that I don't have a firm answer on. But I'm happy to do a little bit of research. I think it's a great question.
All right, thank you for that. A follow-up question about the mosquito control. Mary's wondering, so then what is the best mosquito control for cities to use? Is there anything that's fairly safe?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think I'll take a step back. The broad answer to that is, there's some municipalities that do a really great job with kind of cutting edge, ecologically responsible mosquito control. And you can find kind of the case studies on our website. One that we talk about a lot is Boulder, Colorado. They do a really nice job because they do a lot of monitoring, looking at where mosquito populations are and whether, what the West Nile disease prevalence is, whether the species that actually vector West Nile are present. And then when they start seeing those numbers tick up, what they end up doing is they treat the waterways where those mosquitoes are present using some sort of least toxic, something like a BT, for example. And that's I would say it's a lot safer because it's more targeted and it's easier to control mosquitoes at the larval stage before they're adults. And Boulder basically doesn't have to spray for adults because they do such a good job monitoring these mosquitoes and making sure that they're, treating only these waterways where disease-carrying mosquitoes are present if needed. They also do a lot of, when the mosquito populations start increasing, they do a lot of community outreach where they go door to door, making sure people know to reduce standing water in their own yards, to use personal protection, things like that. So the best mosquito control is early intervention and monitoring. And then trying to control mosquitoes when they're larvae, because that's much more effective. Spraying for adult mosquitoes is more dangerous to, things like pollinators and other beneficial insects that are out and about. And then also, it's kind of a band-aid. It will kill the adult mosquitoes that are flying, but new ones will just emerge. The life cycle of a mosquito is 8 to 10 days. So, it's one of those things where if you're not controlling the larva, they're just going to keep emerging and flying in.
Thank you, Erin. A question from Julie, one of our other volunteers. How long do systemic insecticides last in soil from nurseries?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, the unsatisfying answer is that it really depends. It depends. So different insecticides have different half-lives, and I use that term in the talk. Half-lives are the amount of time it takes for half the pesticide to break down. So it doesn't, and a half-life doesn't mean then it's gone. It just means it's half gone. So it takes multiple half-lives before it gets to a level that's pretty low. And there's some that are have a relatively quick breakdown period, or some are moderately systemic, but there's a lot of them. I was mentioning chlorantraniliprole, which is used in soils often. The half-life for that is almost 2 years. So it lasts in the soil for a really, really long time. And it also depends on factors like the weather, the temperature. There's all of these kind of abiotic factors and the characteristics of the soil itself. These all kind of impact how long the half-life is. So if you know what the insecticide is, you can look this information up. You can email us. We'd be happy to help you find it. But for kind of like an unknown, that's why we kind of recommend you try to remove as much of that soil as possible because it could potentially be months to years.
It's a really good tip. All right, Elizabeth is wondering, are there any studies on the chemical effects from stabilizing structures / voids with polyfoam injected into the ground?
I do not know. That's a good question, and I'm happy, again, if you want to send me an email, Elizabeth, I'm happy to look into that a little bit for you, but I haven't looked at that, or seen anybody talk about the chemical effects from polyfoam injections.
Great questions here today. So Mary, following up with the mosquito questions, will your research be used to help control the release and curb the use of these harmful pesticides? They garden for wildlife and invertebrates and concerned about the overuse of pesticides. And they said, thank you very much for answering their questions.
Hi, Mary. Yeah, thank you so much for this question. And my answer is I hope so. We're certainly using it in our outreach, trying to message to people, the risks of some of these pesticides. And again, this is kind of an area that there hasn't been a ton of research on looking at some of the risks within our residential landscapes. There obviously has been some, but there's a lot of pieces of this puzzle that we don't know. We haven't put together yet. So we're hopeful that as we're obviously talking with a lot of our colleagues at different organizations. Hopefully this is just kind of stacking onto that body of knowledge, and will kind of help contribute to the information that we know about the risks of these pesticides in urban areas. And I think more directly, we are working with some of the parks departments in these areas we sampled. Albuquerque in particular has been really receptive. I think my colleague Jacqueline actually has a call with them coming up. They're interested in kind of using this data to make sure their management practices are pollinator friendly. And yeah, we're also using them to inform some of this information that we're creating and resources we're creating for our B City affiliates. And because so I want to make sure that I emphasize it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of people and a lot of agencies, towns and cities and campuses that understand this is an issue and are really trying to tackle it, and are trying to change their management practices. And there's a lot of them that have been doing really wonderful work. But obviously there's a lot of work still to do. So we're hopeful that the work we're doing will yeah, like you said, kind of hopefully help curb the use of these pesticides.
Great. Well, that was our last question. It's rare that we get through all the questions, and they were really great. So, huge thanks to, oh, we have one more. I'll ask this last, we'll end on this one. Julie had another last question. Is there an easy way for homeowners to test their soil if they find out if it is contaminated? That's a
Yeah,
great question.
that's a really good question, Julie. And unfortunately, most university like soil testing labs, through university extension, they'll look for things like nutrients and sometimes heavy metals and things like that. But they generally won't look for pesticides. So there are labs, though, like the one we used, and that was at Cornell University. And there's also private labs that do this type of testing of soil or plant material. The and you can Google to see if there's one near you that would be willing to do that. I will caution that there's two issues with this. One is that the testing tends to be pretty expensive, on the order of $150 to $300 per one sample. And it also can be a little bit difficult to interpret the results, which is one of the challenges as well. So, you might find things present, whether what that means sometimes can be harder to tell. So to answer your question, there are ways, but it's not necessarily an easy way. I know that's not super satisfying, but uh, yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Really. Well, thank you so much, Erin. This was really informative. And thank you to our audience for joining us today and for the great questions. We will have this up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days, so you can share it with folks if they're interested in learning more. But yeah, I appreciate your time, Erin. As always, it's so nice to have you on these webinars, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your week.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel, and thank you all for coming and listening.